Sean walked between the pub tables, carrying plates and glasses with the lightness of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The comforting aroma of Irish stew filled the air, mixed with the sound of lively conversation and laughter, drowned out by the soft music in the background. But as he approached the tourists' table, everything changed. The group of Americans, who had been visibly irritated since his arrival, gave him a cold stare. He had known something wasn't right from the start, but now, seeing their disdainful expression, something in his chest tightened. The first comment came quickly, cutting like a sharp blade. "The soup is cold!" The atmosphere seemed to freeze around Sean. The murmur of conversation died away as he stared at the face of one of the tourists who seemed to be waiting for a reaction. Sean took a deep breath, feeling the heat of the plate on his arms and the growing pressure on his shoulders. He wasn't a novice. He knew how to deal with difficult customers. But there was something about that table that made him feel trapped. His eyes traveled around the room quickly, as if seeking refuge in the welcoming gaze of a regular customer. But he didn't find it. Everyone was staring. Judgment hung heavy in the air. The waiter forced a smile, trying to stay calm, but the weight of the tourist's words hit him with unexpected force. Each criticism felt like an arrow, and he was already feeling the impact of the second. "This isn't what I ordered." The tension was building, and Sean knew that if he wasn't careful, this little clash would turn into something much bigger. His fingers tightened around the plate, his muscles tense. The worst was yet to come. Sean was a man of 35, with brown hair slightly flecked with grey, and the calm eyes of someone who has seen a lot. His face, marked by slight wrinkles of worry, displayed a discreet smile that rarely faded, but when it did, it brought a sense of comfort to those who observed him. He had worked in the pub for over 10 years and knew the peculiarities of each customer, from the good jokes to the constant complaints. Galway's Irish heat had molded his patience, but also his ability to read people, to understand what words didn't say. He was the kind of person who preferred to stay in control, even when the world around him seemed to be falling apart. The group of tourists at the table that day were 4 Americans, arrogant in the way they viewed everything around them. The leader of the group, a middle-aged man, always seemed ready to point out flaws, his critical eye fixed on every dish that arrived. Next to him, his wife, a tall, impatient woman, grimaced at every bite, uninterested in the authenticity of Irish food. Their 2 children, young and immature, barely contained themselves in jokes about the service and cultural differences. Together, they were a storm of criticism, unaware of the weight of their words. For Sean, however, they were just another challenge to be overcome with grace and patience. He knew that sooner or later he would have to find a way to redress the balance. The pub exuded the cozy smell of aged wood, its walls lined with dark paneling that told the stories of generations gone by. The aroma of Irish stew, cooking slowly in a large pot, mingled with that of homemade bread fresh from the oven, creating a cozy feeling. The sound of conversation flowed softly, interspersed with laughter and the clinking of glasses, creating a vibrant yet tranquil atmosphere, as if time was slowing down there. The traditional Irish music, played by a lone musician in the corner of the bar, flowed with a melancholy melody that seemed to accompany everyone's feelings. The soft light, filtered through the antique glass windows, fell on the dark wooden tables, creating soft shadows. In the air, the freshness of the sea breeze entered discreetly through the open window, bringing with it a light touch of salt and a breath of freedom. The warmth of the fireplace contrasted with the chill of the summer afternoon outside, but inside the pub, everything seemed perfect, balanced. Even with the murmur of criticism coming from one of the tables, the place still emanated a sense of familiarity, like a refuge. It was a calm that somehow still offered comfort, despite the growing tension. Sean approached the table with a calm smile, placing the plates in front of the tourists without showing any sign of discomfort. But as soon as he placed the last plate on the table, the first criticism came as a direct blow. The oldest woman in the group, frowning, looked at the plate in front of her and said impatiently, "The soup is cold. How could you let that happen?" Those words cut through the air. The pub, which until that moment had been filled with laughter and lively conversation, seemed to have fallen silent for a moment. Sean felt the warmth of the dish in his hands, but the pressure in his chest was much stronger. The criticism wasn't just about the soup, it was an attack on his work, on the efforts of everyone there to offer a unique experience. He glanced quickly at the rest of the group, and it didn't take him long to realize that each of them was ready to express an opinion on anything from the shine of the knife to the temperature of the fish. He swallowed and kept his posture, but the feeling of discomfort was undeniable. For a moment, he thought about responding with a joke, perhaps to ease the tension, but he knew that this could be misinterpreted. Every second that passed made it harder to control his growing frustration. The pressure was mounting, but Sean couldn't lose his cool. The balance of the evening was in his hands. Sean quickly moved away from the table, trying to keep his cool. The group of tourists, however, were not willing to let the situation die there. As soon as he walked away, the older man, who had remained silent until then, raised his voice. "The soup was cold. That's unacceptable in any decent restaurant. Are you sure you're doing your job properly?" The tone of disapproval was clear, and the whole room seemed to move to listen. Sean looked into the man's eyes, feeling the pressure of the moment intensifying. He couldn't just walk away or pretend not to hear. The group was watching him intently, waiting for a reaction. He knew that his next move would be crucial. It would be easier to retort, to respond just as rudely, but that would only escalate the situation further, something he didn't want. Trying to maintain his poise, Sean said in a calm voice, "I apologize for the soup. I'll get you a new one." He turned and took a step away, but soon realized he wasn't finished. The young man next to the older man grimaced and said loudly, "What about the fish? It's too dry. I don't know how that can be served to people who pay so much for a meal here." Sean felt a rising wave of frustration. The attack was no longer about one dish or another. It was a constant personal criticism, a judgment on his work, as if he was there only to fail. He felt a silent anger building up inside him, but deep down there was also a sense of powerlessness. Nothing he did seemed to be enough. The heat in the pub seemed to have increased, and the tension was palpable. He felt the weight of their words crushing his back, and the group's gaze was like a fixed beam of light, ready to devour any wrong move he made. His feet, normally firm and confident, now seemed shaky. He didn't know if the solution was to serve the new soup, apologize again, or do something more drastic. He was at a critical point. Sean let out a deep sigh, feeling the tension in his body as he walked to the kitchen. He knew he had to act fast, or the atmosphere in the pub would become unbearable. In the kitchen, the chef, who was already familiar with the routine of complaints, quickly handed him a new bowl of soup, steaming hot. Sean took it firmly and returned to the table. When he got there, he placed the soup in front of the woman with a gentle smile and said, "Here you are, madam. Some hotter soup as requested." She looked at him with a critical eye, but as she tasted the soup, her eyes lit up for a moment. "Yes, now," she murmured, but without sounding genuinely satisfied. Sean breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that perhaps the situation was calming down. The older man nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer, and the other members of The group began to murmur, seemingly less bored. The tension in the room seemed to relax, and Sean felt a slight, false sense of security. Maybe that was enough, he thought, relieved for a moment. But deep down, he knew that the balance could be fragile. The older man's gaze was still there, like a weight that hadn't yet been completely lifted. As Sean tried to regain control of the situation, the feeling of relief didn't last long. The group, now apparently calmer, continued to eat, but a new tension was building in the air. The silence at the table was tense, but not pleasant. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, and Sean knew that this superficial peace was about to break. The critical moment came when the young tourist, who until then had remained silent, raised his voice. He looked directly at Sean, and his words, laden with contempt, cut through the air. "You must be too young to understand what it's like to serve a real customer. I've been to many better places than this, and frankly, your service is far from acceptable." Those words sounded like a punch to Sean's gut. He felt the blood rushing to his head, but he knew he couldn't give in to the provocation. His anger was growing, but he had to keep his cool or all would be lost. The waiter stood still for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard. The tourists waited, their expressions still arrogant, as if they were waiting for a reaction. Sean forced himself to smile, but the feeling of helplessness was unbearable. They were treating him like nothing, as if he was just there to fulfill a role and didn't deserve respect. He realized that the criticism was no longer about the dish or the service. Now he was being attacked as a person, as if his dignity was the target. It was at that moment that he felt the weight of his profession, the constant challenge of remaining respectful when anger almost engulfed him. He knew that if he didn't act now, the atmosphere would become unbearable for everyone. Sean turned to the young tourist and, with a calm that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, said, "If you think I can improve in any way, I'd be happy to hear your suggestions. I'm here to serve you as best I can." His voice was cold but controlled. It was an attempt to resolve the conflict without losing his composure, but the weight of the young man's words seemed to have penetrated his defenses. The tourist, apparently, unwilling to continue the discussion, leaned back in his chair and made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "It's not your job to know what we need. You simply don't have what it takes to be good at what you do." Those words were deeply rooted in ruthless judgment, and Sean knew that this would be the second crisis to be faced. The blood boiled inside him, and the urge to strike back grew. But he knew he couldn't because he would lose everything. His job, his dignity, his calm, all that would be lost. The anger was there in his throat, but he resisted. As the group continued with their sarcastic comments and condemning looks, the room around them seemed to fade away. Sean looked towards the kitchen, but knew he couldn't hide there. He had to take a step forward. The discomfort was palpable. He had faced many difficult situations, but this was one of the most challenging. He felt a growing tension, as if he were on the verge of losing control. But at the same time, a part of him was preparing to give a response that was more than a simple reaction. He couldn't let the words of those tourists shake him so much, and that made him think. What else could he do to restore his own equilibrium? Sean felt increasingly tense as he watched the group of tourists. The criticism went on, and their behavior seemed to be getting more and more arrogant. The challenge was no longer just to serve well, but to deal with something deeper, the feeling that his dignity was being attacked. The older man, the leader of the group, seemed especially pleased with his provocations. Every word he said seemed more like an attempt to humiliate Sean. It was a situation in which he knew he was being tested, not just in his work, but in his character. The man's words echoed in his mind. "You're not good enough to work here, or maybe you're just too Irish to understand what really matters." This comment, more than any other, touched a sore spot in Sean. How should he respond? His mind was spinning. If he simply accepted the humiliation, he would continue to be treated as an inferior. But if he responded aggressively, he would lose everything: his composure, public respect, and perhaps even his job. He found himself in a moral dilemma. How could he defend his dignity without jeopardizing his profession and the environment he held so dear? The balance he had always tried to maintain was at risk. Anger began to grow inside him, a heat spreading through his body. He knew that if he lost control, the rest of the evening would be a disaster. Every word that came out of the tourists' mouths seemed to test him, pushing him to a limit where calm no longer seemed enough. What would he do? His instincts told him to give a sarcastic reply, or perhaps shout back. After all, wasn't that what the tourists were expecting? An explosive reaction that would justify their rude attitude? But he also knew that by doing so, he would lower himself to their level, something he didn't want. It was then that he remembered something his mother had always told him. True strength lies in knowing when to stay silent, when not to react to provocation. These words echoed in his mind, and he realized that what he wanted most now was to prove to himself that he could be stronger than the anger burning inside him. The moral dilemma was in front of him, clear as day: respond aggressively and give in to the anger, or keep his composure, enduring the provocations but not losing his dignity. The choice was difficult, but he knew that the right reaction wouldn't be the easiest. He decided that instead of letting his anger guide him, he would do something unexpected. But what? The dilemma was there, with the pressure mounting by the second. He looked at the group, and once again, the decision forced itself upon him. He needed to find a way to restore his dignity without losing his integrity. This would require more than a simple answer. It was time to find a real solution to the crisis he was facing. While Sean reflected on his decision, the group continued its series of criticisms. Now the provocations had reached a new level. The older woman, with a tired expression, abruptly got up from the table and, with a contemptuous gesture, pushed the plate of fish away. "This is a joke," she said, her voice loud and cutting. "I know the Irish aren't known for their art cuisine, but this is unacceptable." The words echoed through the pub, making everyone around look in the direction of the table. Sean felt his body tense instantly. Something inside him broke with every word thrown in his direction. The criticisms were now not just about the food, but about everything he stood for as a professional and, in a way, as a person. Each one was a blade piercing deeper into his pride. He felt a growing pressure, a weight that seemed to intensify with every second. He was at breaking point. Any wrong move could crumble everything: his tranquility, the atmosphere in the pub, the respect of the other customers. The tourists, now reveling in the situation, exchanged complicit glances as if they were winning the battle. They knew they were pressurizing him, and that was the hardest part for Sean. It was as if they were trying to extract a reaction from him, a slip that would confirm his inferiority. However, the heat of frustration became unbearable. The real urgency came not just from the incessant criticism, but from the realization that if he gave in now, he would lose something far more precious than his control over the situation. He could no longer just be the waiter trying to please the tourists. He needed to restore his dignity firmly without turning everything into a public confrontation. Tension was building up inside him, the instinct to react vehemently, trying to take over. But at the same time, he felt he needed to be more than that. The dilemma of how to respond appropriately squeezed him even more. The urgency increased because everyone's gaze in the pub was now on him. It was as if he was the only character in this story, everyone waiting for his reaction. If he didn't find a way to diffuse this situation, he would lose not only control, but the ability to carry on as the man he had always been. The pressure to respond correctly now seemed unbearable. The woman's words resounded in his mind, and the room seemed to tighten around him. He was on the edge of the precipice, and the only choice now was what he would do to avoid falling. The pub room was tense, like a rope about to snap. The murmur of conversation had died down, and even the soft sound of the music seemed more distant. The eyes of the other customers turned to the tourists' table, and everyone could feel the pressure in the air. Sean was at the center of it all, his movements slow and calculated, as if he were walking on broken glass. He knew that every step, every word, could change the course of the evening. The constant criticism came as a growing weight, but now, instead of cringing, he felt something deeper, something more powerful, the need to keep his dignity intact. The young tourist, watching Sean with a challenging gaze, made a sarcastic comment about the way he served the table. "Are you going to do something about it, or are you just going to carry on with your ostrich face?" he said, with a smug smile. Sean took a deep breath, the heat rising in his throat, the desire to respond with anger burning inside him. But he stood his ground, only a slight movement of his jaw signaling his effort to remain calm. His eyes traveled over the faces of the tourists, and it was then that he realized what was at stake. It wasn't just a question of being humiliated in front of others. Now it was about who he would be, how he would see himself when it was all over. The tension reached its peak when the older man, with a wicked grin, let out a definitive comment. "I think you're going to end up losing your job over this." Sean felt the weight of those words like a direct blow, but at the same time a clarity came over him. He knew what he had to do. He knew that the moment to act had arrived. The room seemed to grow even quieter, the seconds stretching out like a rubber band about to snap. The final confrontation was imminent. Sean took a step forwards, anger mingling with a surprising calm. His eyes fixed on the tourists, one by one, as the weight of the last provocation dissolved. He knew that this was the decisive moment, the fine line between losing everything or regaining his dignity. The pub was absolutely silent, all eyes on him. The young tourist smiled dismissively, as if he expected Sean to snap. But instead of giving in to anger, Sean found a more powerful response, one that didn't come from his words, but from the way he chose to react. He took a deep breath and, with a soft smile, looked directly at the older man. "You know," Sean began, his voice controlled, "what you're doing is a bit unfair, don't you think? Maybe if you spent more time enjoying the moment, instead of looking for flaws in everything, you might realize the true value of being here." The tone was calm, almost relaxed, but the words carried an immense weight, a simple wisdom that the tourists hadn't expected. They were so focused on criticizing that they missed what really mattered. The reaction was immediate. The tourist's smug smile crumbled, replaced by a surprised countenance. He didn't know how to react. Sean was no longer just defending his work. He was challenging their arrogant behavior. The room, once tense, now seemed to warm up, as if the atmosphere itself had recognized the change. The older man fell silent, and for a moment, no one else said a word. Silence took over, but Sean didn't stop there. He looked around, observing the faces of the other customers who were now watching him with a mixture of respect and admiration. He knew that somehow his response had not only touched the holidaymakers, but also shown those present that true strength lay in how we deal with adversity, not in how quick we are to strike back. I understand that we all have our expectations, but I also believe that a little patience can change the way we see things, he continued, his voice calm and firm. The group fell silent, and the young tourist, who had seemed so arrogant before, finally lowered his eyes, as if realizing the truth in Sean's words. It was a silent but powerful victory. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't lost his composure. He had simply shown an undeniable truth. Respect is not earned by shouting or provoking, but by the way we treat others, even when they are not being fair to us. The tourists were disconcerted, but they could no longer maintain their offensive posture. There was something about Sean, an immense calm that now made them question themselves, and for the first time that night, they were silent. The confrontation wasn't physical, but the battle was won, not with shouts or attacks, but with the firmness of Sean's response. He had redeemed his dignity and somehow also taught everyone around him about the value of patience and mutual respect. As silence overtook the pub and the tourists seemed to absorb Sean's response, something unexpected happened. The older man, who until then had been implacable, suddenly stood up from his chair. The room held its breath, waiting for more provocation, but what happened next was completely different. The man looked directly at Sean and, with a slight curve to the corner of his mouth, said, "Well, you got me. I thought you were just going to be some waiter, but you're more than that." For a moment, Sean didn't know how to react. Those words were not an apology, but an acknowledgement of his intelligence and composure. The tourist continued, now with a softer, almost thoughtful tone of voice. "I was wrong. I should have been more patient." He gestured to the other members of the group, who remained silent, as if taken by surprise by the leader's sudden change of attitude. What surprised Sean the most, and everyone around him, was what came next. The older man unexpectedly pulled out his wallet and left a generous tip on the table. It's rare to see someone deal with such class. "You deserve it," he said, before turning and leaving the pub with his group without another word. The room looked shocked, but at the same time, there was a sense of relief and even respect. Sean stood still for a moment, unsure if it had really happened. The unexpected had materialized. Sean stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the tip left on the table, the sound of the tourists leaving the pub still echoing in his mind. The anger that had been burning inside him was now dissipating, replaced by a feeling of lightness, as if the weight of all the taunts had been lifted from his shoulders. He felt a wave of relief, but also a quiet satisfaction, something that went beyond the simple victory over the tourists. The real victory, he realized, was not in the words exchanged or their recognition, but in the way he had stood his ground. He hadn't given in to anger, hadn't given in to the temptation to respond aggressively. On the contrary, he had found a strength within himself that he had never known he possessed, the strength to respond with calm and dignity. The confrontation was not one with shouting or harsh words, but with the ability to remain in control, to know when to be silent and when to speak. In an instant, the frustration and tension that had built up over the course of the evening was transformed into something deeper: self-knowledge and self-respect. Sean smiled to himself, feeling that whatever happened next, he had made the right choice. He had won not only the external battle, but the internal war that challenged him. The pub returned to its usual rhythm when the tourists finally left, without any more words, without any more criticism. Sean, still standing by the table, watched the door close behind them, the sound of the lock resounding in the air, like a full stop to the tension that had been hanging around. For a moment, everything was silent. He looked at the tip left on the table, and, as much as it was a gesture of recognition, the monetary value seemed irrelevant in the face of the silent victory he had just won. The confrontation had been resolved, but in a way he hadn't expected. He had restored his dignity without lowering himself to the hostility of the tourists, and that was more valuable than any amount of money. The other customers began to resume their conversations, some casting discreet glances in Sean's direction with silent, approving smiles. The atmosphere in the pub, which had been heavy before, now seemed lighter, more natural. The atmosphere was cozy again, the sounds of music and conversation flowing without interruption. Sean returned to his routine, but with renewed confidence. He knew that he had handled the situation in the best possible way. Nothing needed to be said. The customers knew what had happened, and the very atmosphere of the pub seemed to validate his attitude. Sean continued his work, with his head held high, feeling that he had done more than just resolve a conflict. He had become stronger. The tourists, although visibly embarrassed, went on their way, but something in their demeanor seemed to have changed. The leader of the group, who had previously been implacable and arrogant, now walked with a lowered posture, as if some of his self-sufficiency had faded. It wasn't a radical change, but it was there, subtle, reflecting the impact of his words and how they had been met with calm and dignity. Even without apologizing, he seemed to have somehow absorbed Sean's silent lesson. For Sean, the consequences were more profound. He felt that by handling the crisis with such grace, he had not only earned the respect of the other customers, but also his own. The pub, which had previously felt like a stage for tension, was now a place where he felt secure in his position, in his ability to face any situation calmly. His confidence had expanded. He knew he could face any challenge with the same composure, no matter how difficult. The other customers, who had watched everything in silence, now saw him in a different light. Sean was no longer just the waiter who waited tables. He was someone worthy of respect, someone who had been able to face adversity in a way that few others could. Sean's story reminds us that true strength does not lie in impulsive reactions, but in the ability to maintain dignity and self-control in the face of adversity. In a world where quick responses and instant reactions are often exalted, Sean has shown that calm and patience are even more powerful weapons. His firm stance in the face of provocation, without giving in to the impulse to respond aggressively, shows us that true respect is earned not through imposition, but through self-reliance and understanding one's own limits. The confrontation in the pub was more than a simple clash between a waiter and his customers. It was a reflection on how we react when we are challenged. Sean didn't allow the tourists to disrespect him, but he did it in a way that didn't demean them. He didn't need to humiliate anyone to assert his worth. This teaches us that respect doesn't have to be earned through sharp or vindictive responses, but by quietly trusting in our own actions and ability to turn a conflict into an opportunity for growth. In the end, Sean not only won the external battle, but also underwent an internal transformation. He found himself stronger, more authentic, and more aware of his own power to respond. The real victory, after all, was personal.